Hello, everyone, and thank you for jumping on the latest edition of our Sustainability Webinar Series. My name is Brendan Woodruff. I'm the co-chair of the Operations and Engagement Subcommittee. I'd like to take the time to thank everybody for joining us today. A couple of housekeeping things before we do get started. First, the webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the GreenNY website later on this week. So if you know anybody who wanted to see it, or there's any slides or anything you want to go back and see later, it will be located there. In addition, if you do have questions as we go along today, please type them into the chat box. We'll get to those at the end. What we'll do is we'll have a presenter go through, and then at the end I'll read them out and get to all of the different questions. So just as a reminder as well, these are monthly webinars. We do have our next one coming up in July, and that is going to be on stopping the spread of invasive species and what you can do. So if you're interested in that topic as well, make sure to put it on your calendar. These are the second Tuesday of the month at noon. So without further ado, we'll get started here. I'd like to welcome Mina Visera from Cornell Cooperative Extension of Suffolk County, who's going to talk on how we can protect our pollinators. It's an issue that we've heard quite a bit about, especially with declining bee populations, and it's one that there's quite a bit that all of us can do to make a difference on. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mina.
Great. Thanks, Brendan. Thanks for inviting me to present today. It's great to be here with all of you today through this webinar. If you're unable to hear me at any time, please just Brendan know, and I'll do my best to somehow adjust that. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about this huge topic of protecting pollinators, and you can kind of see just on my first slide there that it's a big, diverse group of animals, essentially. So all the way to the left, you'll see this tiny, tiny little fly that I captured in an image. It was a pollinator for boxwoods that had started blooming at the end of March. That's in a hoop house, but that fly was either overwintering in that hoop house or came in because we started opening the doors to cool off the hoop house. But it was awake early in the season, getting ready to pollinate, and it was happy to see those boxwood flowers there for it. You know, all the way to the right-hand side there, we have the monarch butterfly at the end of the season. That picture was taken at the end of July or end of September, beginning of October, on some native asters. So big group, and we're going to review some of them today. Let's see. Okay, there we go. I was trying to advance my slide. So what we're going to review today is just discuss some of the various animals or wildlife, insects and birds and what have you that make up this big group of pollinators. We're going to try and understand some of their habitat needs. I'll address some of those. And then I'm going to review how to create your own naturescape. So if you already have a pollinator garden, I'm going to give you some tips on how to evaluate maybe the sustainability of it, or if you need to add any additional elements to it, or I'll basically give you some tips on how to create one as well. I think it's always a good idea to have some pollinator or habitat gardens within your garden. In the next few slides, I'm going to review some of these wonderful posters that were created over the last few years from some of the federal agencies and also some national and local agencies. And there are these posters that were promoting pollinator awareness. So these wonderful campaigns. And what I really appreciated about them is that they emphasize the diversity of pollinators that are present within our ecosystems that perform this service of pollination. As you can see, it's everything from the butterflies, of course, to birds, bats, and then the bees, beetles, and birds. So it's a huge, diverse group of animals. And of course, you know, not only did these posters address the diversity of pollinators, but they also, they're awareness campaigns, right? So they want you to know this is what you can do for pollinators as well. Today, we're going to primarily focus on some of our native bees, but really, whenever you talk about pollinator gardens, you're talking about supporting wildlife in general. But we are going to get to know some of the needs of our native bees. And in New York State, there's an estimated 416 native bees. So again, diverse group, not only within species, but, you know, of course, just within the category in general. So I'm hoping by the end of this talk, people will be a little more open to inviting some native bees and looking out for them in their yard because they're such a fascinating group of insects. This is one of my favorite posters. I swear, I only have a couple of more of these posters, but this is just a beautiful poster. Something that I like about these awareness campaigns is that these posters really capture the eye, and I love hanging them up at any of my educational programs. I love shade trees, and I really love that this poster was making people aware that trees need bees in order to produce seed. Of course, there's fruit trees that need pollination in order to produce that fruit, but the primary end product is the seed. So let's just look at a few pictures as well of some of the flowers that trees actually produce. This is the beautiful flower of the red maple of the Acer rubrums, and they bloom very early in the season. Primarily, people associate trees with being wind pollinated, and red maple is certainly primarily pollinated by wind, right? People, never like seeing all the pollen that's covering their trees or their houses, or it gets them all sniffly. But during rainy seasons like we've had this season, pollination by wind can be reduced because wind does not move, or pollen rather, doesn't move very well during rainy days. And so what these flowers have is a little bit of nectar as well to attract insects so they can ensure that their pollen is transferred to another tree, another flower, or what have you. So really just interesting kind of evolution that occurs with these trees in how they attract insects to them. This is the tulip tree, and the tulip tree is definitely insect pollinated, and you can kind of tell just by the shape of the flower. So not only do we have diversity of pollinators, but we also have diversity of flower structure and flower shape. And so it gives you a sense of what sort of insect or animal is attracted to this tree to pollinate the flowers. So beetles would certainly be attracted to something like this. There's a lot of nectar that's produced by the tulip tree flower. So you're going to get all sorts of insects that are going to be fumbling around in there trying to get some water and nectar while at the same time providing that pollination service. This is the last poster, I swear. I think it is. But I love this poster as well because it reminds people that pollination does not only happen during daylight hours. It's happening 24 hours a day, including during the nighttime hours. I'm part of the horticultural world, and you not only have flowers that bloom during the day, but you have many flowers that bloom at night. And something that people like to do is create these moon gardens where it's just flowers. It's a garden created mostly of like the silver foliage plants and plants that also have many white flowers. Well, other people like to call them moon moth gardens as well because there are all these different insects, including many different species of moths and bats too, of course, that are attracted to these nighttime gardens to feed from the water and nectar that these plants provide. So as you could probably, been hearing me talk about pollination quite a bit, pollinator gardens certainly attract all these insects to them, and the main purpose of them is for pollination. So for these next few slides, we're just going to review what pollination is because it's such an important service. Without pollination, trees simply would not, we wouldn't have the diversity of plants that we have within the landscape. So there's two different types of pollination. You have self-pollination, and that promotes a lot of uniformity within the plants, and that's important for a lot of our commodity crops, such as the cereals and the legumes. And then we have cross-pollination. That's what we're going to focus on today because pollinator gardens promote cross-pollination, which is performed by many different species of insects and birds and what have you. And examples given that depend on cross-pollination and the service provided by these animals are apple trees and blueberries, very important crops. This quote from this article released by the Natural Resources Defense Council in March 2011 basically highlights that cross-pollination is important to several different food crops out there, throughout the world, so 30%. But, what I underlined in this quote is that 90% of our wild plants need cross-pollination in order to thrive, in order to continue existing. So you may begin questioning, well, how can my pollinator garden possibly help? Well, it will help in numerous ways just because of the destruction of habitat that's occurring in our wild areas. So now let's take a closer look of what exactly cross-pollination is. And basically, cross-pollination is just the simple transfer of pollen from one flower to another flower. So a bee is attracted to a flower, It goes by the reproductive structures. So a bee will collect pollen from the stamens, or it will pass by the stamens and access the nectar within the flower. And so part of that pollen, it gets stuck to this insect, and when it visits another flower, part of that pollen is transferred to the female reproductive structure, the pistil, and those pollen grains make their way down into the ovary of the plant. And you need several visits from these bees. So you need several grains of pollen in order to create that nice juicy apple that people like to eat or to produce viable seed. And as I note on this slide, so wind and animals are agents of cross-pollination. But when you have cross-pollination versus that self-pollination I described earlier, you get that higher degree of genetic variability. So here's a cross-section of an actual flower. So again, it just kind of highlights the how far some of the bees have to, or the insects have to travel in order to get down to where that sweet nectar is. That's what creates the fragrance of the flower. That's what attracts many of the insects or birds or what have you to the flower. So it needs to go past all those reproductive structures in order to access that tasty treat that provides it with so much energy. Yes, some of you may be thinking, well, what about those nectar robbers? And there are insects that will just cut a little hole at the base of the flower without having to enter it. So it bypasses actually providing cross-pollination, but thankfully not every single insect or animal will do that. So what is the bee getting from the pollen, from the nectar, and other resources that these flowers are providing? So when you have these pollinator gardens and these flowers are, just looking gorgeous for you and providing all this wonderful fragrance, the bee is collecting the pollen primarily to support its young. So pollen provides lipids, important lipids, proteins, and vitamins so that young can grow to be an adult insect, a mature insect. The nectar is primarily what the bee or the bird or what have you feeds off of for energy. So it's a direct food for that bee. It's an immediate food. And then, of course, flowers will also have pockets of water in order for the bee to, or other animal to enjoy that water as well. So you're getting all these visitations from these pollinators and these beautiful flowers. The main purpose of attracting all these pollinators to them is to produce seed. Yes, you have apple trees and fruit trees that produce the wonderful fruit in order to get their seed carried elsewhere. But when you have a flower like the coneflower or common milkweed, you have the wind that will disperse these seeds elsewhere. And if pollination was successful, if it was viable, if enough of those pollen grains were transferred to the pistil, well, then that seed will produce a genetically diverse plant of the same species. So that's the primary purpose of these pollination gardens, is to continue the existence of these plants. And then, of course, the bees themselves or the other animals can continue the existence as well because they get all sorts of foraging resources from them. So flowers need pollination to produce seed. That's very important in natural areas. This is a beautiful picture of Hempstead Plains in Nassau County, and it's a gorgeous meadow. And it's a harsh environment because of how dry it is, but it's impressive in terms of the diversity of plants that exist there. And our native pollinators are big supporters of allowing that to happen. So here we have a picture of a cultivated garden. And all sorts of cultivated plants are within this garden. So we have to begin questioning, okay, well, how does my garden support these pollinators? How can I either make it be attractive to pollinators? Well, sometimes there are flowers that do not attract insects or pollinators at all because those reproductive structures, any nectar has been bred out of the plant, and they're just there to look pretty. They may provide cover for insects or pollinators, so that's beneficial in that way. But you just want to make sure that your garden is made up of a diverse selection of plants so you don't end up with a sterile type of environment. The other question that we have to think about is many people who have these gardens are terrified of insects. I'm someone who's scared of spiders, but I still welcome them in my garden because I appreciate what they do and I know they're very important. But when I used to be a gardener, I had clients who said, I would love all the flowers, but I really don't want any bees in my garden. So I think what people have to remember is that bees aren't bad. I know that there are people who are allergic to bees, and that's, of course, very serious and life-threatening. However, many of our native bees are so tiny that the stinger that they have cannot penetrate the skin. So they cannot sting. Yes, bumblebees can sting, and I have been stung by many bumblebees because I got too close to them. But for the most part, many of our native bees, the stinger is just too small and they cannot hurt us. What you're seeing on the screen now is a squash bee, and they are very important to pollinating all sorts of plants within the squash family. So pumpkins and muskmelons, they provide those services, and they spend a lot of time in squash flowers. This bee is just incredibly tiny, and it was I found it from a squash plant that was growing from my compost. So I was thrilled to actually be able to capture the picture, but I'm hoping you're able to tell just how tiny this is. This is at the very interior of the flower, and there's no way this bee could ever harm me. Have any of you ever been in any of these butterfly houses? People love creating butterfly gardens because they love attracting these beautiful insects to their garden. They're absolutely gorgeous. I kind of find it funny that people pay money to go into these butterfly gardens, or butterfly houses, but I understand the reason why they're there. They're also creating awareness for conservation of these beautiful insects. And that's part of the reason why I love the posters, because bees are beautiful as well, and so are other beneficial insects and pollinators. And I think if any of you out there have a neighbor or teach on this subject as well, I think it's important to remind people that all insects deserve conservation and deserve access to our yards, because unfortunately most people are terrified of them. And I'm not sure if it's because of the legs, because even once they know that these bees can't sting them, many of them can't sting them, they still have that fear. I attribute it as well to the buzzing. If you've ever had a bee buzz around your hair, your head, or get stuck in your hair like I have, it is very unnerving. But if the bee isn't in that aggressive state, it will not sting you. These bees are just looking for a place to nest, and it's highly unlikely that this woman is going to get stung by any of these bees because they have not been given that aggressive call to actually protect the nest. They are simply searching for a nest. If any of you have ever had a hummingbird buzz very close to your ear, that is more terrifying than any other bee, I feel. So there's a lot of fear out there, and I think slowly people will overcome that with more education, as has been happening. I love this slide from the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. It's a great website and resource. I encourage you all to visit it. Many people like to say, I support bees because I keep bees. However, what the Xerces Society likes to make people realize is that beekeeping is not bee conservation. What they're keeping are European honeybees. They're not native. Yes, they're very important, but essentially they attribute keeping bees to the same thing as keeping chickens. They're kind of like your pet almost. And yes, they're providing important pollination services in that area, but they're not providing any services for the native bees in that area. So what's a big difference between European honeybees and our native bees is that European honeybees provide honey. You actually get honey from this bee, and it's such a wonderful thing to taste and to use. And our native honeybees, or rather our native bees, of course, don't produce honey, but people love keeping their own bees because of this reason. But just remember that it's not providing conservation for our bees. One thing I want to point out as a major difference between our European honeybees and our native bees is that our native bees, because of the diversity of them, they start pollinating very early in the season. So you have some that wake up at the end of March and that go all the way through the end of November. And they're not as finicky about the weather. When I had to do some observational studies with European honeybees and comparing them to the eastern bumblebees would wake up from their hive before sunrise, 4:30 in the morning, they were up and about. whereas the European honeybee, they wake up after sunrise, and if it's even a little bit cloudy outside, they tend to hang around the hive more, and they will not go out and pollinate as if it were a sunny day. So our native bees are they're just used to our climate here compared to the Mediterranean climate of where the European honeybees are native to. So I was kind of alluding to this chart a little bit in what I was just saying. This is from a great resource from the Wild Pollinators of Eastern Apple Orchards, and it talks about conserving all these native bees, and some of them that are non-native too, that support pollination of fruit trees. So if we look at the bottom axis there, the x-axis, you can see the calendar, the growing season, so March all the way through December there. And then on the y-axis at the top, you have the fruit trees, and then you have all the different, some of the different species that pollinate those trees. So one thing I just want to highlight is look how early the cellophane bees wake up, and also the mason bees in March. You know, that's just incredible. It's cold there. Some people don't even want to go out because it's still too cold for them, even here on Long Island. And then check out the bumblebees. They are out very late into the growing season. Some of you may see them buzzing about on the asters and on the goldenrods that are still blooming in their garden. And so they're out providing that pollination service very late into the growing season. So there are 3 different types of native bees. Unlike the European honeybees that have these perennial hives that are maintained year after year, none of our native bees have a nest or a hive that is perennial. Our bumblebees, they are social insects, so they do create a hive, but it's an annual hive. So it's very, very early, beginning of the spring, you may see a bumblebee flying about, and that's the queen bee, and she is searching for a location to build her nest, so she can lay the eggs, and then the worker bees will then serve her and provide food for any larvae that is produced in that hive. So they're the only ones that kind of produce this type of annual social nest or hive. The majority of our native bees are either ground nesting bees or tunnel nesting bees. So we're going to spend a couple of slides looking at this. But for the ground nesting bees, different sizes, they're usually very small. Their nests can easily be mistaken for wormholes. They wake up, as we saw, pretty early in the season, so you can start seeing some of their holes in the ground in April, mid-April. I have some right in my driveway. I have a very sandy driveway, and on the edge there are ground nesting bees. And they really do just look like wormholes, but there are bees that are solitary nesters, but they're kind of gregarious, so they'll have a few nests right next to each other. And they burrow these tunnels into the sand, and they have these various chambers that are off of it that they lay an egg, they put a little bit of pollen, and then they pack it away until the following year when those eggs hatch, and the cycle starts all over again. So it's similar with the tunnel nesting bees. They are solitary, but they build their nests, these chambered nests, within stems, within hollowed stems, or you even have leaf-cutting bees. Oops, let me go back here. Leaf-cutting bees build these tunnels with actual leaves. So if you ever see these type of holes within your leaves, you know that a leaf-cutter bee has visited. And they basically create these cigars, and you can kind of see the chambers that are created there. Within each of those chambers is an egg, some pollen, in order to support the growth of that bee until it emerges next spring. And I was just reading an IPM report out of Maryland, and somebody from Bartlett Tree Experts had included this image. They had a potted plant on their deck, and they noticed that at the base something was inserted into it. And so this is from a leafcutter bee had inserted these cigars, these little nests, at the base of these pots. And so, again, hardly no harm is caused by the bee doing this. You just have to leave that pot there on your deck until the following year to allow those bees to emerge and provide that pollination service. So this is a reference that I was talking about that I really like. It's called Wild Pollinators of Eastern Apple Orchards and How to Conserve Them. And so the next few upcoming slides, we're going to look at some pages from within this guide. So if we look here, this page is reviewing the ground nesters. So quite a few different animals are bees rather, are ground nesters. The little yellow arrow that I included in this image is pointing out the size of these bees. So 1 inch is about 25 millimeters. So if we look at the dark sweat bees, they're only about 4 to 11 millimeters in size. That's very, very tiny. So again, these bees cannot hurt you. The stingers on them just truly cannot, penetrate our skin. If we go to another page, here we have examples of cavity nesters. So the cavity nesters are the ones that create those hives, the bumblebees and honeybees, and they have those social hives. So you have these bees that are working together to support the hive. And then you have tunnel nesters on the other side that are primarily solitary and collect pollen to have these single nests that will then support a single bee later on following year. Size is really important to note because it indicates how far that bee will travel from the nest to forage. Now, really, you don't want that bee to expend so much energy in order to search for food and water or a nesting site even, but it is dictated by their body size. So I apologize for kind of the busyness of this slide. I had been doing it with animation to kind of pop them up one at a time, but if you go to the very center of this graphic, you'll see that if you have some of those small sweat bees, they are not going to travel very far in search of food, right? So only about a half a mile radius. Compare that to the European honeybee, that's a decent sized bee, and they'll travel as far as 2 miles from their nest in search of food and water. And compare that to the even larger bees, the bumblebees and the carpenter bees, they can travel up to 5 miles in search of food and water to support their young. So quite impressive how far these bees will travel, but of course you don't want them to expend that much energy, so that's why our gardens are so important in providing forage that they're looking for, and also the nesting habitat that they need. So they don't need to go very far in some of these suburban and urban environments, because the bees are there, even if the wild natural areas are not. This is another slide from the Xerces Society, and it just emphasizes, as Brendan was saying earlier, the decline of some of our native bees. And our bumblebees, various species of bumblebees are in decline because of habitat loss or for various reasons that researchers are looking into. But there are several different species that are unfortunately just not being seen as much anymore. So some of the reasons that is just causing the decline of our native bees and pollinators and just wildlife in general, habitat loss, the deterioration of the habitat, decrease in diversity because of invasive plants that overtake some of our natural areas and just dramatically reduce the number of species within that area. Disease and pathogens are a huge problem. Pesticides, of course, and then climate change. Climate change is an interesting one in how it's affecting our insects because it's creating flower deserts. Because of the extension of the season or the oddity of the weather, you have these periods where there's no flowers, but the pollinators are still out, or they have woken up, but yet the plant that it normally is associated with has not produced any flowers yet, either because of some weird climate thing. And so you end up with these flower deserts, and you end up with these insects that die before they're able to lay any eggs. So very sad state indeed. So pollinator gardens provide, important resources for these insects that wake up throughout the season. When you talk to Dan Gilrain, some of you may have heard Dan Gilrain last month talk. I forget what he talked about, but he always loves calling pollinator gardens caterpillar gardens. And I basically prefer to just call them wildlife gardens because it's really hard just to say, just to plant various species to attract one type of insect. I only want butterflies. You're going to get all sorts of animals visiting that garden. And one thing that you have to expect is you can't expect a perfect garden. You can have a formal garden still be a pollinator or wildlife garden, but you're going to have to anticipate that leaves are going to be eaten, you're going to have holes in there, and you really have to welcome insect pests because insect pests promote other sorts of, birds that feed off of them, and other insects that will reduce the number of those insect pests, but you have to be able to tolerate seeing them. And in this image here of this milkweed, you'll notice that there are aphids all over this plant. Now, of course, the caterpillars are just munching away on the leaves, but you're going to have another insect that will prey on those aphids. You just have to realize that the wildlife within that garden will promote the balance within it. So it's not like you're going to end up with nothing, just sticks in your garden. By promoting diversity of the different plant species, then that helps with maintaining balance within the garden. The National Wildlife Federation, they have one of these certification programs where you can certify your garden as wildlife habitat. And they just have a few criteria that are necessary to have. So you need to have food, so that means diversity of plants, not only of flowering plants, but various type of plants, because flowers produce food, but you also need various hedgerows, for example, to provide places to raise young and cover. And of course, you need some sort of water source as well. And you can certainly provide that either by having a pond or just a bowl of water will do as well that you change out frequently. This image is from Susan Payek, and I served on the Long Island Native Plant Initiative board with her. And she lives in Nassau County, and she was really excited about actually having a native garden. She took her formal garden, she made it a native, she put all sorts of native plants in it, and also some non-natives. And she noticed all these insects that were coming to her garden, and she realized that this particular bee looked different from the bumblebees that were visiting her garden. She sent it off, the picture, to the Xerces Society, and she learned that this is indeed the golden northern bumblebee. Populations are in decline, and she was so thrilled to have this bee visit her garden. So not only do you plant these pollinator gardens, but you can pay attention to see what's visiting your garden, so then you can get the same thrill of realizing that these insects, these animals appreciate what you have done. So basically, what can you do to create a wildlife garden? Well, you need to provide food, so all sorts of different species of flowers, both woody and herbaceous, so they can have food throughout the growing season. And the growing season is usually March until November. Maybe it's the end of October for some of you upstate. Safe nesting sites, and then protection from pesticides. So we're going to spend a little bit more time on the first two. Protections from pesticides is a different topic altogether. So this information I got from the pollinatorgardens.org website, and I just want you to focus on the third bullet point there. So typical suburban landscape is only 20 to 30% native plant species. People always ask, should I only have native plants within my garden? And I'm at the standpoint where you can have native plants with non-native plants. And as research is showing, native plants are important for supporting native wildlife. So it's pretty alarming that the typical suburban landscape only has 20 to 30% native plant species, but I guess I shouldn't be too alarmed by that because I see a lot of landscapes that are pretty low in diversity. I'm just going to briefly talk about this one study from November 2018. So this study looked into how the Carolina chickadee used gardens to support its young. So it's pretty incredible that one nesting Carolina chickadee will collect more than 400 caterpillars each day. That's an impressive amount of caterpillars or insects to remove from the landscape. But the other thing that this study learned is that this Carolina chickadee needs at least 70% of the landscape to be in native plants to keep their population steady. And that's because those native plants support insect populations that are necessary, that is a food source for this chickadee. If you had non-native plants, that insect does not recognize certain non-native plants as a host, and so it will skip that garden and go someplace else. So I thought this was a really important statistic that demonstrates why native plants are important. You can have non-native plants and native plants that are equally able to grow in native soils, that are equally able to grow within the native, within the climate. but you need native plants in order to support native wildlife. So if you want to evaluate your own pollinator garden that you currently have right now, or you want to build your own, what you really need to think about is diversification, right? So you need to diversify the flower shapes, because by having different flower shapes, that will attract all sorts of different types of insects and birds and what have you to your garden. So you not only need to diversify within a species, you need, or a genera, within a taxa, you need to diversify at the botanical family level. So if you were to look at your garden and you realize, oh my gosh, I have a lot of plants in the aster family in my garden, and the rose family. So examples of plants in the rose family are apple, serviceberry, cherry, spirea, lady's mantle, and then example of plants in the aster family are, of course, aster, coneflower, eupatorium, goldenrod, marigold, sunflowers, coreopsis, and zinnia. So you can quickly realize that your garden isn't as diverse as you think. So be aware of what plants are at the various botanical levels, because that will truly demonstrate a wonderful diversity that will host all sorts of different insects to your garden. And then, of course, include woody plants as well. Those trees that I talked about earlier, the shrubs, they help extend that season, right? Even bulbs, if you want to, they definitely extend the season. So just think about the entire growing season. So March going all the way, even through December here on Long Island, the weird warm falls that we've been having. The bees are staying out later and later. So these are 3 very important tips in terms of how to really create a sustainable wildlife garden. Another thing to consider is that you don't always need flowers to support these insects. Many of these flowering trees or herbaceous plants, they are providing what's called extrafloral nectaries. So when the flowers have gone by, they're still supporting these insects by giving them these little areas, these little wells of nectar. And the plant gets protection out of this because these insects will protect these little nectaries with their life. So any insect pest is basically killed off because they don't want anybody else to get that nectar from those nectaries. And also, you don't need to have flowers in order for plants to produce these nectaries. There's ferns. Ferns will produce what's called foliar nectaries in order to attract these beneficial insects to protect it from harmful insects. When you are creating your habitat garden or evaluating it, you really have to think at the habitat level. So you're not only providing food, you're also trying to encourage these insects and other pollinators to live in your garden. So that means providing nesting sites. And you can do that by including bunch grasses, so grasses such as switchgrass or little blue stem within your garden, because bumblebees, for example, will nest within the messiness that's created within that bunch grass. And then also, make sure you have some bare sandy areas or areas that aren't necessarily covered with mulch or plant material 100% of the time. And of course, hedgerows or even just a pile of sticks will encourage nesting. There's a campaign out there to become a messy gardener or a lazy gardener. Some of you that are watching this may see on the right-hand side, oh, that just looks beautiful. I love cutting back my garden in the fall. It's so neat. That's what I like to see. But the movement now is to wait until spring before you cut back your garden. So basically you wait until there's been about 4 or 5 days of temperatures in the 50s, and then you can, cut back your garden, because many of the insects that have been overwintering in that garden have begun to wake up after they start experiencing those warm temperatures. And they'll wake up pretty quickly after a few days of temps in the 50s. So there is a movement to become a lazy gardener. The Habitat Network, Cornell Lab, and the Nature Conservancy had this pledge to become a lazy gardener. They got nearly 5,000 pledges. This campaign has ended, but you can still go to this website, Garden Messy for Wildlife, and they have all sorts of resources and calendars to help you kind of evaluate your garden and learn what can be done more to support wildlife from your garden. So just some resources. There's so many out there, but there are some resources out there. So check out pollinatorgardens.org, the Audubon Native Plants Database, and of course the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. One thing that you can probably know was missing from this presentation are plant lists. There are many excellent plant lists out there, so I encourage you all to visit these websites and others so you can look at the plants that are good for your area. So that's pretty much my entire presentation. Thank you all for your time and attention, and I'm happy to take any questions as well. Some of you may be recognizing the flower that I have on this final slide. It's partridge pea, and it's an actual, it's an annual plant. It's native to Long Island. I believe it's native to elsewhere in New York, but it has these beautiful flowers, but also all sorts of insects are attracted to this annual because of the extrafloral nectaries that are at the base of the leaves. So once you start looking for these things on the plants in your garden, you'll start noticing them. And I encourage you all to become naturalists and observe what's going on in your garden, because you'll be rewarded and you'll just want to better the habitat that you're creating with your landscape. So thank you very much.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Mina.
Oh, you're welcome.
We do have some questions that have come in.
Okay.
And if anybody else on the line does have further questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box. And just right off the bat, I want to say, I said thank you before, but that was really in-depth, and I really enjoyed kind of the background of it and learning more about why protecting pollinators is important. And I hope everybody else on the line got that as well. So it's more than just a slogan. It's kind of, here's the reasons why specifically. So that was really fantastic.
Okay.
One random question that I do have, I saw you put up bergamot, a picture of that. Is that the flower that they make Earl Grey tea out of?
That's a good question. Let's see, the Monarda, I believe. Let me just go back. So this plant right here?
Yep.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I have no idea. That's a really good question, though.
Yeah, I know the flavor is described as bergamot, but I wasn't sure if that was the...
There's, the Monarda, if you were to crush the leaves, has a wonderful fragrance to it. And I do love Earl Grey tea, which is flavored with bergamot, I believe. But I've never looked into what particular species. It may be a species of Monarda, but there are different species out there. So which one is for the tea, or if it's even the Monarda species or genera, I'm not sure. But that's an excellent question. I'm going to look it up.
Okay. Yeah, awesome. So the first question here, do wasps pollinate?
Yes. Yep, absolutely, and that's a great question. There are all sorts of wasps. There's this beautiful black iridescent one that likes visiting all sorts of different plants, but in particular I have a mountain mint that's growing in my yard, and every single time I love when it flowers, because this beautiful black iridescent wasp visits it, and it's huge. It's like 1.5 inches, but I'm not afraid of it at all, because I know it's more interested in collecting the nectar than it is in harming me. But, again, I'm not an entomologist, so I'm not sure of all the different services that these wasps provide, but I do know that many of them do provide important pollination services for the plants out there. Mm-hmm. But they sting, too. Some of them do sting.
Yeah, those ones are not fun if you get stung by them. So are there any resources that you have for people looking for what native plants to plant in their area? I know that New York has a number of different climate zones. Is there any kind of one-stop shop where people can figure out, what they should be planting that's native in their region?
The USDA created these pollinator books for the different regions within the United States. I think it was USDA. And they're great. I think I can find out the name of it. But if you were to Google pollinator plants for the Northeast, or the Mid-Atlantic, these helpful booklets will come up. But let me see if I can just grab the name of them, because I became obsessed with downloading all of them because I was really impressed with them. Pollinator friendly. All right, so here's one for Eastern Broadleaf Forest, selecting, let me open up this PDF. So yeah, the title of this one is Selecting Plants for Pollinators, a regional guide for farmers, land managers, and gardeners in the Eastern Broadleaf Forest. So this particular guide includes the states of Connecticut, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and parts of Delaware, Kentucky, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee. So as you can see, there certainly is overlap in terms of the plants that are suitable for a region. You certainly have to look at the hardiness of the plant to see if it will overwinter. But these are excellent booklets. And so I guess if you were to Google selecting plants for pollinators, you'll probably get the list. I'm trying to see who, so the author is Elizabeth L. Ley, so that's L-E-Y, and it's an NAPPC and Pollinator Partnership publication. So this Elizabeth Ley is a botanist out of Maryland. So I was really impressed with these booklets. And the PDFs, these PDFs are available online, so you can search them out.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah.
The next question gets a little bit into kind of the pesticide issue of it, but if folks are not using any pesticides on their gardens themselves, but they go to a nursery to purchase something, there's been a lot of kind of attention around neonicotinoids.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any kind of recommendations around finding plants that haven't been treated with those? Are there any kind of certification programs or anything like that?
Well, there are growers who are pledging voluntarily, saying that they don't use these neonics on their plants. It's a hard topic because in order to produce these plants en masse, these ornamental plants en masse, and actually have a nice saleable plant, they need to use some of these insecticides. But many of them are very responsible, right? And they use the proper timing. So they're not spraying these plants or applying the insecticide to these plants when they're in bloom. So there are some voluntary pledges. I know that some of the big box stores have said we will not accept any plants that have been sprayed with these neonics. And, the unfortunate thing is that maybe Dan Gilrain addressed this, but some of these neonics, it's a family of insecticides. So some of them are very targeted and not as harmful as some of the alternatives. So again, it's a tricky topic to discuss. And I know that the growers are environmentalists just like many of us, and they have their own gardens. So it's challenging to produce a crop that is saleable and without using some of these important insecticides. So to answer the question, I guess the short answer is yes, there are some growers that are pledging, and usually you can either talk to your retail garden center or whichever place you like to frequent and talk to them about it. I'm sure they'll be happy to discuss the topic with you.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So you mentioned the lazy gardening movement there.
Mm-hmm.
For folks that do have grass and they do some maintenance on their lawn, are there certain types of grasses that are better than others? Does the grass impact kind of pollinators at all?
Ornamental grasses, or do you mean like people's lawns?
Just like lawns.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of people don't like to have clover or dandelions in their lawn, but dandelions are great because the taproot helps aerate the soil, and very early pollinators will visit those flowers. So you can just encourage or not kill some of these flowering plants that end up in the lawn. So I love having clover in my lawn, and I understand some people don't like to have clover in their lawn because if they walk through it, they may get stung by the honey or bumblebee that like to frequently, visit the flowers. But I know the Xerces Society do promote, letting these flowering plants remain within the lawn. But otherwise, try not to have such a perfect lawn if you want to encourage nesting. I think a fun thing to do, maybe an experiment you could do, is allow some of the lawn to grow at the edges, and don't mind if some of the spaces in between the lawn die out. A friend of mine who definitely does not have the perfect lawn, he realized that bumblebees were nesting in a really messy part of his lawn that he was not maintaining very well. So, that's why you have this campaign of being a messy gardener for wildlife, because the wildlife will say, oh, this is perfect, thank you, it's a perfect site for my for my nest. Whereas usually the point of view of the gardener or the homeowner is like, oh God, that looks so messy and sloppy. So I guess it just depends on changing our point of view of how we view our lawns.
Mm-hmm. And along with that, fertilizers, you mentioned some of the kind of ground nesting and tunneling pollinators there. Are there any kind of fertilizers that would negatively impact them?
Fertilizers are salts, so you certainly don't want to overdo it in terms of applying too much salts, because that's just not good for the plants in general and the leaching that may occur. But these tunnel nesters do line their nests in almost like this waterproof layer of sorts. So I know they are providing excellent protection for their egg-laying sites. It seems like if you were to overwater your garden and you get puddling quite a bit, that would not be good in terms of encouraging ground nesters. But if you are over-fertilizing, I think your plants will tell you more. They would be an indicator. Really, if for your lawn, for example, you only need about 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. So that's very little nitrogen. And if you decide to just use a recycling lawnmower, you'll need even less that you need to apply. So the best thing that you can do is, instead of using some of these fertilizers, just use compost. You can top dress with compost. Very little amounts, like even 1/4 inch, will do wonders for your soil and for your lawn.
Mm-hmm. And if anybody else has any final questions, feel free to type them into the chat box now. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we do have our next one coming up in July. We have somebody speaking on how to stop the spread of invasive species. In this webinar and the previous one, we've talked quite a bit about native plantings and other things you can do there, but that'll get into more of the nuts and bolts of when you're traveling and kind of tips you can take and things you can do in your garden. Seeing no more questions that have come in, I want to thank Amina for taking the time today to put this together and present it. And if anybody does have any other questions about the webinar series, or you want to get more involved in sustainability at state agencies, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is on the Green New York website's page for the webinar series. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a good day.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Brendan. This was a lot of fun.